That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G are specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. And welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Well, Ben, you've got a bit of a story to tell about how you spent election night, American election night, it already seems a long time ago. Was it last Wednesday?
It was Tuesday night.
Tuesday into Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a tradition with a group of friends that every 4 years we get together and stay up all night watching the election. And it's a tradition that has just about survived COVID. We were just able to do it, I think, before the lockdown came into effect, and survived having small children and sleepless nights from that as well. So we stayed up all night, and I sent a message home at about 1:30 in the morning saying, we think Trump has won. So indeed he had. And I, unfortunately, Tom, I got you to make a prediction last week about who would win.
I said nothing.
You said nothing. And I thought that Trump was going to win. I put together an electoral map that called every state but Nevada correctly. So I was very, very, very close with my prediction, which I should have committed to the podcast.
No, you should commit it to the betting shop, Ben, first of all.
Should have placed a bet as well, but too late now. Yeah. And here we are. So the greatest comeback, I think it probably beats Richard Nixon's comeback in '68. By some stretch, actually.
I think that's right. I mean, it's an astonishing piece of news, really, to look at the various maps that have been pulled together, the various stats about winning the popular vote, winning obviously the electoral college, and also I think at the time of writing, we know he's got the Senate, and we suspect he's going to get the House. That may be very imminent. I said the time of writing there, didn't I, Ben? Which just shows
you did, but we know what you mean. We know what you mean.
Yeah. Know what you mean.
So is it the first popular vote won by a Republican since 2004? I think
something like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of firsts. It's a lot of firsts. But I think what we need to talk about this morning, Ben, is what does all of this mean for free expression? And this was the first thing we had in this week's newsletter. What does this win mean for free expression? And we can share our thoughts about this, Ben. But why don't I kick off by saying, well, there's a lot of positives that come out of this for free expression. And the way into this is to think about the woke world that we talk about every single week on this podcast, that is both of our day jobs, in terms of this is the main way in which free expression has been shut down, is through wokery, through identitarian politics and EDI, all of these things that I think our listeners would be extraordinarily bored with in many ways, as are we, in terms of they're very empty concepts, so many of them. They're not rich. They don't build us up in any way as a society or a culture, a lot of them. Where sadly they could have positive elements, but so often they're just captured by the wokery mindset, or mind virus, as Toby would say. And this is a real kick in the teeth in every way for woke politics. You know, Donald Trump has set himself against all of this in all sorts of ways. So, you know, when we think about that side of our work, it's very positive, I think. And but the way I think about it as well, Ben, is we have to separate out the free expression elements from wokery in and of itself. And actually, there is such a thing as right-wing cancel culture, or cancel culture on the right, which we actually saw in the aftermath of Trump's assassination attempt. We did see people losing their jobs. We did see things being deplatformed. I think a music band was deplatformed for publicly reveling in the assassination attempt of President Trump. And so immediately you see the same things that we have tended to learn to put against the far left. We see those same ideas starting to come out on the right, which is the worry.
The first assassination attempt, particularly with those iconic, extraordinary photographs. In the days after that, you did see from the right this strange lowering of the threshold when it comes to incitement to violence, and lots of people on the right saying that by demonizing Donald Trump, the Democrats had incited violence against him, which I think is an absurd claim for somebody with the bombastic rhetorical style of Donald Trump to claim. The idea that any demonization of your opponent must be beyond the pale. I mean, I think that's clearly a ludicrous thing for Republicans to be arguing. But we did see quite a lot of that in the aftermath of the first assassination attempt. So I agree. I think of course censorship can and has historically come from the right. The overwhelming preponderance in this day and age is from the woke left, but within that, of course, we include the private sector and big business. A lot of censorship, in fact, most of the censorship that we are dealing with as an organisation comes from people who are being censored or punished or investigated by their employer.
Yeah. Well, another thing when it comes to censorship is that Trump has long opposed the censorship of social media, and especially lawful speech on social media. And I understand that he argued that X, Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms, they didn't deserve certain protections that enabled them to censor content without being treated as publishers. Which meant that they could remove content. And we saw that happen during COVID. We've seen it happen since. We've seen that happen and grow as a phenomenon. And so he's always been opposed to that censorship. And in particular, he supported the release of the Twitter files. No surprise, he's got a close relationship with Elon Musk as well, who was at the vanguard of making sure that the Twitter files got released and revealed the censorship industrial complex that was going on with these platforms. So, lots of good, positive things there about Trump and about free speech. But there's a flip side, I think, as well, which is he's never been a fan of traditional news organizations, probably because they haven't been a fan of him.
To put it quite mildly.
To put it quite mildly, and needs some Trump derangement syndrome that has broken out again in the last week. But he hasn't always been a staunch free speech defender. For example, there is a landmark Supreme Court decision called New York Times Company versus Sullivan. It dates back to 1964, and it ensures that litigious public figures suing for defamation have to meet an extremely high standard of proving actual malice. And that the person who's published a story knew that the story was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And Trump has argued that important decision that obviously protects publishers and reporters and journalists and media platforms, he's argued that should be revisited. And the reality is that's shielded the press from intimidation through lawsuits that will quickly impoverish individuals and quickly impoverish companies and news outlets and the like. So that is worrying. That obviously, if Trump still believes that it should be revisited, then protections for the traditional press might be taken away, and we might not like the traditional press. We might complain about them in all sorts of ways, but I think those of us who love free expression are not looking in any way to stop them from being able to publish or critique, even when they're critiquing those that we or they or whoever agrees with.
One of the points I wanted to make, Tom, And I think you're right that we need to disaggregate to an extent the broader culture war and particularly debate about trans rights and women's spaces from the kind of pure freedom of speech issues like the one you've spoken about with respect to press freedom. But I think you described this election obviously as a kick in the teeth for woke progressives. I think this election has finally given light to the idea that the culture war is this confected outrage that is invented by the right or the right-wing press or right-wing politicians to divide, and that it's something that ordinary people have no business caring about, and that it's something that ordinary people are indoctrinated in by sinister right-wing forces. I think this exposes the complete nonsense of that line of argument and shows that actually people do care what is being taught to their children in schools. They do care that their children are being indoctrinated by trans ideology in the classroom. They do care about protecting freedom of speech and the right to speak on X or Facebook with a degree of freedom, and that all of these things do actually matter. And no doubt there will be people who continue to persist in that argument, as there will be people who continue to persist in abusing Trump's coalition of voters, and people who just refuse to reflect on this result or what it means. But I wonder, I mean, how many kicks can this old order withstand? I mean, it's had 2016. It's had Brexit. It's had 2019 Conservative victory. It's now had Trump being elected for a second term. You just wonder how immune from self-reflection can woke progressives be, and are they going to continue to think, well, no, we just need to clamp down on the flow of information?
I don't believe something that is so cult-like and religious really ever gives up willingly, and I think people double down. I've noticed the reaction we had after Brexit in 2016 has broken out again in terms of, oh, it's only racist, it's only misogynist, it's only find your own label and attach it, in this case, not to a Brexit voter, but to a Trump voter. It's exactly the same dialogue, exactly the same conversation. And I think that it absolutely backs up this idea that we're living through a time now of self-censorship in the public space. You know, we found out with our EDI survey that we did earlier in the year, we found out that 62% of the people in that survey, which cut across the whole of the British workforce, 62% were self-censoring in some way, either saying things they didn't believe or not saying what they did believe. And what we're seeing is that's really taken root in our society since the Brexit vote. Obviously, there have been other populist revolts over time. And I think what that shows is it's taken root. People are not saying anything until they get to the ballot box, when they can just say what they really think. And I've noticed this in friendship groups. I've noticed this in chat groups, online, offline, that if you are guilty of wrongthink, which I think you and I probably are, and many of our listeners are probably guilty of wrongthink, this idea that there is only one right way of thinking, then you simply don't want to fight all the time. You want to live your life, and you don't want to battle with everyone, including your children, including your grandchildren, your spouse, your friends, those that matter to you. Whereas the cult-like religious people, which is what the woke thing is, won't back down. So a lot of us are just ducking and staying out. And therefore I'm more pessimistic than ever that this will just die a death. We need to beat this way of thinking out of our societies, and it's a long game, I think.
Well, the other possibility is that Trump's re-election has a toxifying effect on all mainstream right-wing politics in Britain, and that it has a kind of Enoch Powell effect, where following rivers of blood, talking about immigration becomes incredibly difficult, and that Trump could have that same effect here. Now, the reason I think that probably won't happen is that we have a Labour government which cannot further alienate him, rather than a Labour opposition which could speak with considerable freedom,
or cannot further alienate its own people.
Yeah, so Starmer and David Lammy particularly obviously has this record of absolutely trashing Trump and being very abusive about him, and it's of course impossible for him or Starmer to continue to speak like that now that they are in government and need to maintain a diplomatic relationship. So perhaps I'm arguing against myself. Perhaps that will mean that Trump cannot quite become the toxic hate figure of 2016, 2020, because now the British left have to speak quite diplomatically about him, or at least the parts of the left that are in power.
Well,
I don't know.
If we're saying that everyone on the right is a deplorable, if we're saying that everyone on the right is garbage, if we're saying that everyone on the right is a, inverted commas, fascist, then it's abundantly clear from the outcomes of these votes, and I would include, the reform vote at the last election. It's abundantly clear that by so saying, you are dismissing potentially well over 50% of the population. And that's a stupid thing to do. At some point, and this is me arguing against my previous point, at some point you have to realize that you are so in a minority. Number one, you are not Athanasius at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Yes, I stand alone against the world, where he saved the doctrine of the Trinity. Very, very rarely are we Athanasius if we're in that much of a minority. Therefore, they have to rethink. They have to get over themselves. And I mean, why they? Who do I mean? I mean those who are against free expression, those who are causing all this self-censorship, those who are imposing this new cultural way of thinking. You have to get over yourself and realize you are the minority, and maybe you might not be on the right side of history.
Well, quite. But there's no sign of that level of self-reflection, is there, from the Labour government in any area of policy whatsoever, and their loveless landslide has not imbued them with any sense of humility or any desire to govern from.
Yeah, and let's remember what Sir Keir said at the beginning. He said, I want to tread on everybody's life more lightly. And as I think I've said a number of times, that's what he said. But what's actually happened is that from a free expression perspective, at least we've seen a mighty great Monty Python foot come out of the clouds and squash UK citizens in this way, in that way, and in every other way since the 4th of July when it comes to free expression. From the Higher Education Act onwards.
Yes, well, I was just going to say, let's move on to that very topic, Tom, which we've had some. Well, there's two quite welcome bits of sort of media commentary that have occurred about this. The first, Tom, do you want to talk about the letter?
Yes. Yeah, so some of Britain's most eminent authors, this was reported in the Times, have told ministers that literary freedom in the UK, we're back home, is being eroded by their failure to stand up to cancel culture on university campuses. And those signing the letter, this is what's interesting, a real key people in our literary cultural sphere. The letter, they include the novelist Ian McEwan, Lady Antonia Fraser, Lionel Shriver, and they've been joined by the philosopher AC Grayling, the actor and author Stephen Fry, and the former poet laureate Sir Andrew Motion. So you've got a gallery there, Ben, of some of our best creative literary minds. I mean, other signatories, moving on, we've got historians there. One of your favorites, Ben, Tom Holland, co-host of The Rest Is History podcast, literary agent Neil Blair, and the former Olympic swimmer Sharon Davies. And what they've said is in their letter, and I'm sure the wonderful thing about that group is that they would not agree on there are a lot of things they would disagree vehemently about, even about certain things within the culture wars and cancel culture. I'm sure they would not agree by any means on everything. But what they do agree is they accuse the government of failing to safeguard humane and liberal values. So the bedrock, essentially, of who we are in the United Kingdom, what we think of as underpinning our liberal democracy. And they've called on the government to drop opposition to implementing the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act that we've talked about many, many times. Bridget Phillipson is obviously the Education Secretary who made that happen. So it's these letters matter, Ben. Sometimes I read this and think, well, it's just a letter being sent in. But when you have signatories like that matters.
Yes, I think the idea of having AC Grayling and Lionel Shriver signing the same letter, that tells you something, doesn't it? So it's very welcome. The other, also in the Times, it's the leading article which came out today, that's Monday, the 11th of November, in which the Times trashes the government's decision to scrap this piece of legislation, and particularly for attempting to scrap it as if people would not notice that it was not being rolled out. And as we've spoken about in many previous episodes, the government has not repealed the legislation. It's not had a vote at the House of Commons. It's not gone through any legislative process. It simply said it's a pocket stealth veto. We're not going to enact the rest of this legislation, despite the fact that it had been given royal assent and gone through the entire, of course, legislative process. So very welcome intervention.
But interesting about that letter is that it models exactly what the ideologues refuse to do. The ideologues refuse to compromise. If you're not with us, you're against us. The ultimate cultic response to anyone who's not on their side, whether that's extreme transgender ideology, whether that's extreme critical race theory or grievance politics. And what the letter models, to your point about would we normally see those names together on many debates? No, they'd be on the other side. They'd be on opposing sides but what they've modeled is what it means actually to lay down your arms in order to make a deeper point about what is at stake when we lose the higher education sector.
Yeah.
And I think that is very notable in itself. And we should always spot these moments of time when people lay down their arms and say there's a deeper issue at risk here. And then it becomes very potent and it becomes very powerful. But when it comes to cults, I'm not sure it'll be enough to snap many people out of it, but maybe enough to snap our education secretary, or at least get her to think again on that.
Fingers crossed.
Our next item is all about Ofcom. Now, Ofcom is becoming increasingly more powerful in the UK since the Online Safety Act came in. They're drafting guidance on how they're going to make that happen. Good things. There are some good things in this, which is protecting particularly the things that I'm concerned about, children from seeing inappropriate stuff that could genuinely be harmful to them online. Children are obviously the most vulnerable people in our society, and they've got this mighty great weapon in their hands of the internet, which can just reach into their living rooms or their bedrooms and terrify them or make them bully them in effect, and 100 other things. So there are good things about controlling what goes onto social media from the perspective of children. That's certainly, I always like to start with that, Ben, because we are good at trashing things from a free expression perspective but we need to measure that with the other side. But Ofcom has been given more and more power, and yet it seems to be waging this war against outlets that are fighting cancel culture, and in particular GB News. So there was an article in Spiked about Ofcom's vendetta against GB News. Most of our listeners, most of our viewers will be aware that GB News was fined £100,000 for apparently breaking due impartiality rules over the People's Forum programme on which Rishi Sunak appeared, but there was no one on the other side. It was just an uncontested platform to promote the policies.
Well, I mean, you say there's no one on the other side, apart from all the people asking him hostile questions from the audience.
Exactly. And so it really did feel a bit like GB News turned a blind eye to that truth, Ben, which anyone who watched it could see. That
you mean Ofcom? Ofcom turned a blind eye.
Ofcom turned a blind eye to the fact the audience were hostile. And the trouble is that, okay, maybe Ofcom felt that was not sufficiently impartial. But what's it doing with other outlets? And the Spiked article lists several examples of where Ofcom hasn't stepped in. The almost obvious was when Ed Bull sat across from his own wife, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, on ITV's Good Morning Britain, and lobbed. He probably wanted to make sure he wasn't put into the spare room that night, so he lobbed fairly softball questions about the riots and about the disorder over the summer. I mean, you do not, in a grown-up news report, you do not put husband and wife on opposite sides, because clearly you're not going to have them going at each other in a sort of hammer and tongs way, because otherwise divorce proceedings would be going on the next day. It's so obvious. And yet Ofcom didn't step in on that. And there are many other examples. I mean, the BBC, which we've talked about many, many times, and their approach to Israel-Palestine, which we've talked about since the 7th of October 2023, when reports on that hospital strike in particular, very early on, it was Israel, when actually it wasn't Israel, but the BBC reported it the wrong way around, and that had real life effects. I believe that led to a visit. I can't remember whether it was an ambassador or it might even have been a president somewhere. Didn't go to a meeting later in that week because of it. So it had diplomatic implications. Going too early on one side rather than the other. So the BBC is another example. Another example of the BBC, obviously, is the way that it insists on using the preferred pronouns of rapists and such like, who are transgender, and really not thinking sufficiently about the victim. So Ofcom is going against outlets like GB News, and the concern we have is that Ofcom is becoming more and more powerful. So where does this go, Ben, is sort of the question it leaves us with.
Well, nowhere good. Yeah. Nowhere good is the answer. The idea that Ofcom, which has done such a shoddy job, and I think behaves in such a transparent way against GB News, the idea that Ofcom should be the internet regulator is disastrous. And of course, this is what we've been arguing when the Conservative government was forcing this through. And we are monitoring the way in which Ofcom is taking up its new duties and responding to consultations and so on about what the enforcement is going to look like of the Online Safety Act. In terms of the legislation itself, I mean, as you said, Tom, there are some non-contentious elements in there about protecting children from harm. The trouble with the Online Safety Act was that it became a Christmas tree piece of legislation where everybody was hanging their own ornament on it,
their own bauble.
And why protecting children from harm should be part of the same piece of legislation which subjects adults to a Ofcom-led regime of internet regulation is not clear to me, nor why this was passed by a Conservative government. We did manage to get some of the worst elements of it stripped out, as we've spoken about before, but nonetheless, it is not encouraging. And I think this is going to be one of the interesting dimensions of the Trump presidency. And we've already heard some we've heard noises in this direction already, that the new administration is not going to look favourably on allied countries that are restricting or subjecting to overbearing regulation American companies, American social media companies, tech companies, and so on. And that's something that Europe and Britain are, I hope, going to have to be very aware of, that if we are enforcing incredibly strict censorship regimes, internet regulation, whatever you want to call it, that the American government is not going to look favourably on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's going to be a very interesting few years. We're back to the topic we started with, aren't we? And the implications of potentially positive implications, actually, for free speech of Trump's win when it comes to online censorship, certainly, which has infected us so badly now. And I do worry for new startups like GB News. It's tough. It's a tough space to get into. It takes a lot of cash. The runway that they need to do this, to set up the infrastructure, to pay the producers, to pay the hosts of the programs. And I know that there have been bumps along the road for places like GB News, places like Talk.
Yeah.
And as they establish themselves, we don't want to lose them. They are such an important voice against what the mainstream seems to have drunk the Kool-Aid. They're a voice against that, and I worry about it, Ben. Maybe I worry too much, because I think there's now enough people in the country who would there would be an outcry if it was clear, if it was too overt, that there was an attempt to shut down these new channels, and it would not work well for the wokesters and the ideologues in the end. But yeah, it's a breath of fresh air, I tell you, to be able to switch away from the mainstream to places like GB News, to places like Talk, and to podcast world as well.
Long may it continue.
I think that's probably all we have for this week, isn't it, Ben? So thank you again to everyone for listening and for watching in these incredible times we're living through, times of change. But we'll continue battling in the background in the UK for free speech for another week. But thank you for listening.
Goodbye.